Sidhani kuna mzazi ako ready na school fees sahi. Na kama wako ready na school fees, maybe one or two.
Ni ghafla wengi hawakutayarisha pesa, alafu wengi wameishiwa na kazi. Sijui sasa hapo hizi shule zitatoelewa kama hatuna pesa ama watatupatia muda wa kulipa fee.
Mimi kufunguliwa kwa shule kidogo hapo Magoha shani koroga, kwa sababu namba moja sina school fees, namba mbili watoto wana hata uniform, hata bags pia sijui kwenye zilienda.
Sisi hatuna hata vitabu vimeenda na maji. Sisi hatuko ready kwa sababu shule yetu imeenda na maji.
Kitabu hakuna, uniform hakuna, alienda tu na maji. Na tutafanya namna gani? Serikali, si unisaidie. Mr. Magoha, uko wapi? Tufanye namna gani?
So pertinent questions there, from missing bags to schools drowning in hyacinth and all kinds of challenges. But Yvonne, I'll start with you. It was quite interesting that we had this national conference on COVID where everybody had kind of expected that the school calendar would be unveiled. And then the president, it was an anticlimax for some people, like, well, we have no problem opening, but we need to discuss the how. So there was a sense in which many parents thought, you know what, this thing is not happening now. Then barely a week later, the CS comes and releases this circular that basically gives parents between 5 to 6 days to prepare their children to go back to school.
And when he said the how, like you say, in that circular that was sent by the Ministry of Education on the reopening, they reiterated the guidelines, which, by the way, they had already provided before.
Yeah.
So there was nothing altogether different from those guidelines that they had provided for schools. So I didn't see this supposed how or something that seemed particularly different. And even when the CS was before the committee in the House, he did say, look, at some point we have to open schools. And I understand that their reasoning is, look, the parents and all the other adults in the household are going out there attending political rallies, they're going to work, they're going to the bar, they're going to church. And if it is about bringing that, having the children vulnerable, well, they're already vulnerable.
And the children themselves are going out in the estates,
exactly,
not wearing masks.
And so for me, I found it interesting that it was the how, and then when we got the guidelines, it was pretty much the same thing as what had been issued by the Ministry of Education before. And I think it is interesting because there's a number of things that have to be done. Training of teachers, retraining them. Because remember, especially the ones who are doing CBC grade 4, it is something, the training that was ongoing. And remember, they'd only done, what, 9 weeks, of the curriculum at the beginning. The monies that were to be sent to schools, I understand that was to be done today, was it? To enable the schools to do that. But there should also be, if we're talking about the how, the support of the private sector. I mean, I know, for some they may think, but private schools are really just as important infrastructure. And from what we've heard today, 196 schools have permanently closed, never to be reopened again. They've gone into other business. We've seen people who are using the schools to grow, to rear chicken.
Yeah.
I think there was one school, I think it was somewhere here in Nairobi, they just repainted the walls and they're doing something totally different. And this has affected 54,000 learners who are exam candidates who are registered to these particular exam centers. And maybe those are some of the things we want to hear about in the how you're going to accommodate these learners. Where do they go? Do they go to other exam centers that are private? Do they start to pay the fees all over again? What happened to the exam registration fee that they had put in place? But I've also seen something interesting that is happening in Uganda, and maybe we might want to do that. So for them, they got a bit of longer notice, about 3 weeks. And I understand this weekend or over the next couple of days, the students are going through counseling. And the parents are, advised and, encouraged to take part in it as well. And so are the teachers, particularly for the exam candidates, because what a year this has been. I mean, if we as adults have found this, very disconcerting time, what of these candidates who, usually have the pressures of doing an exam? And so these are some of the things we want to hear about in the how, which didn't seem altogether different when we had the reopening
they mentioned
of next week.
Psychosocial support. I hope it is something that is a bit structured, so that actually it's a serious part.
And when is that going to happen, though? Because in the 5 days, you know, there's all that hurry of getting back to school, getting your requirements, the masks, the whatnot. So perhaps a little bit more time. Not to say that schools shouldn't have reopened. I mean, but you know, perhaps it's the timing of it that seemed quite sudden. Oh, and sorry, one other thing. People who had gone up country, remember there's a lot of people that actually just relocated back to the village and said Nairobi hakukaliki. You know, what happens to them? They have a week to get their act together, come back to the city or wherever else, you know, they were domiciled pre-COVID, and to start to, you know.
But perhaps there should have been a thinking about, for example, the stimulus packages that they had for other sectors. I mean, because if you think about it, even the private schools are in a dilemma.
Absolutely.
Because whereas they feel the parents, you know, they feel like everybody has gone through this. I've had, they were saying, for example, they will try and understand the parents, they can pay in installments, but they also in dire straits. They have loans. Some of them took their school buses on loans, the buildings and those kinds of things, and they literally run on the school fees that the parents have to give every time the school opens. So right now they are in a real problem, and yet because we messed up our public education system, the private schools have become a really important part of our schooling system. And personally, I'm very passionate about the demise of public schooling, because I went through the public school system, and I know that a lot of Kenyans are actually going through the public school system. But right now you find everywhere in this city, everybody's kind of trying to take their child to whatever academy they can find around, because they don't have the confidence that we once did in public institutions. Actually, Linus will tell you that there was a time in this country when going to a private school was a problem. Like, what do you mean going to a private school? It was not seen as prestigious as it is now. It was actually more prestigious to go to a public institution. But right now it is the reverse. Yet actually the people who make policy, the people who implement the policies went to public schools. But for some reason now we have spent a lot of time just kind of degrading our public school infrastructure. If you go to some of the good schools, even in this city, you know, the Nairobi Primary, the Rabai Road and all of these places, you find that they are pale shadows of their former selves. Yet here we are now, we are saying 196, I think, private schools closed permanently, and therefore 50,000 plus students are lost. Some of them actually paid, you know, for the exam fees, registered in all these schools, and were preparing to do their exams.
I think
what are you going to do with those?
Because you have 11,000 private schools in Kenya, with the 196 that are closing down. And then there are 2.5 million learners. 9,800 of these 11,000 schools are primary schools, which have 2.3 million of the pupils, and 1,600 are secondary, with a capacity of about 274,000 students. And Yvonne speaks of the how. Some of these private schools have actually said, we are not going to open on Monday because we are not ready. So we are still continuing with the preparations to clean the school, to sanitize, to fumigate, to do all those things. But these are the, I think, the upper class private schools, where they are telling their students, you can continue with online learning while we still get ourselves ready for your children to come to school. But we saw the footage of the school in Ahero. That school and 7 others, which had about over 800 students, are completely submerged in water because of the flooding that happened in the area. There are no books, there are no desks, there's nothing, there are no facilities. Those children have nowhere to go. And then you give them only a week to get ready to take them to school. And then what happened, we saw the letter on social media about the Sukari Presbyterian School here in Nairobi that had the most ridiculous directive to parents that if your child missed the online classes during the 7-month period, consider your child ametolewa kwa shule, so you have to come and register again and make all those payments. And one parent was saying it was my choice not to bring my child because I didn't feel maybe the online classes was well structured. Another one said that he was unable to afford the, I think, 8,000 shillings they were supposed to pay for those classes. But now because of that, his child is suffering. So for me, I feel this decision was a bit too abrupt, because why I don't understand was the president did not announce it during that COVID-19 conference. I honestly don't get that, because it was just a week later when it was actually a circular that was released to the media that schools are opening. It wasn't really spoken out in a public event. And finally, about reopening schools, children have been home for long, but we've seen in other places across the world where reopening of schools have led to a second and a third wave. across the world, Israel and some places in Europe, that when children opened, even I think in New York, they were opening schools, now they've closed again because now the rate of infection has gone high. We have been lucky in terms of the infection rates going down in the past few weeks, and that's what I think necessitated this decision to reopen schools. But we just need to be careful to make sure that the schools are ready. I heard CS Magoha saying lack of social distancing should not be a reason for parents and teachers not to allow students to school, and that really worried me because
actually
I
he said it's impossible, social distancing in schools.
Yeah.
That's what he said in Parliament, that it's not going to be possible.
So mwapeleke tu watoto shuleni hata kama kuna social distancing. That's what he's telling us.
Yes,
I think the conflicting messaging has not been very helpful. The government has not demonstrated firmness and clarity in the leadership of the issue of education. And it starts with what Jamila has pointed out there, that if it was so critical, if you have thought through it, why was it not featuring in the COVID conference at the KICC? It should have been a big statement there. But what was the big statement? Pubs. Mnaweza kunywa pombe sasa. I think that was the announcement.
Yeah.
And this is where really this government sometimes puts itself in an awkward position, because the lives of millions, 2.5 and above million children that we're talking about really matters. The fact that schools have been off the calendar for more than half a year should actually concern the government enough to be more clear in its communication on what it intends to do in rolling out education. And Joe, you referred to the past, and I would imagine in the times of Peter Olo Aringo, the Minister for Education, under President Daniel Arap Moi, who was very passionate and personal about education. Some matters really must be led from the top and with a lot of clarity. I sympathize with CS Magoha. He's been talking to himself in most cases, making statements and retracting them and amending them, and somehow on Monday he'll end up having kids in school, hopefully. And teachers as well. The incoherence has been really sad for a sector that is so important. Education of children of Kenya requires more clarity than this government has demonstrated.
I look at it this way, Joe. You see, the reality is that it would be nice for kids to go back to school. Definitely. It would be nice if they were to go back to school. But even as we say let them go back to school, we must deal sufficiently with the question of how. That is extremely important, because we talked about the other day millions of people who have lost jobs. These are people who had children in school, I suppose, or they were benefiting other people who have children in schools. And so if this number of people have lost job opportunities, it means they have also lost their source of livelihood and a source of earning. If schools are going back, if children are going back to school, what will happen? Are there any mitigating factors? For example, like the government say, go back to school. In terms of fees, this is what the government will do, and this is what you will do as a parent. I heard the CS talk about if you don't have school fees and your child is in a private school, take them to a public school, which I found quite insensitive, because there's a reason why that parent opted to take their child to a private school and not a public school. And even those public schools are already...
Do they have the capacity
they are populated.
To take up these?
Do they have the capacity? Yeah. Number one. Number two, this period of COVID-19 from March to now, and I want to repeat that question here again. How many schools will be resuming studies on Monday that have extra classrooms built in this period of COVID-19? How many? If the infrastructure was dilapidated before COVID, and children are going back to the same dilapidated infrastructure post-COVID, or in this intervening period of COVID, what are we talking about? Wouldn't we have probably invested some money that was spent on young men and women who are slashing, maybe take them there to build classrooms and so on and so forth, such that these are long-term benefit, that these resources that were allocated to these young men would have been allocated to the same group of youths, but to do something that is, you know, long-term, so
even
to say.
Even the NYS.
Yeah, even the NYS and everybody else. But I think something is amiss here. And it tells us that maybe as we discuss this COVID-19 and the resumption to school, I think there's a greater need to look at the general administration and management of the Ministry of Education. Because when you told parents that consider this year lost, and then all of a sudden take children back to school within a period of 5 days or thereabout, what are we talking about?
There's one thing, and just to reiterate what you were saying.
Consider the year lost except October,
November,
which is
December.
part of the year.
Incidentally. I don't know if you recall.
The fall and rise of 2020.
Isn't it? If you recall, when we had the tough restrictions at the beginning of the pandemic, and most of that time was supposedly to allow, you know, the healthcare facilities to build their capacity so that they were able to, you know, cope with the rising case. Much in that same manner, how did the Ministry of Education utilize that time when children were not in school, when schools were closed, when they were at home, when there was restriction of movement? How did they use that time to enable these schools to be ready, such that when the regulations are coming in now, you know, and the guidelines, sorry, that's the word they used, in terms of making sure that the schools are, you know, ready for COVID-19, how has that time been used, the last 7 months? What sort of changes are we going to see in the schools as the children resume on Monday? Or will it be a wasted opportunity? So all these 7 months, nothing has been done. It would also be interesting to see how much of the COVID-19 stimulus funds were channeled to the Ministry of Education, how that money was used, you know, if at all, and, you know, used in what way? What was their strategy during the 7 months? Because there are many schools, including public, that may not meet some of those very strict guidelines that are required. What happens to those schools if they don't meet the requirements that have been put in place? Will they not be allowed to open, both private and public? Even the private institutions, by the way, despite the fact that in addition to the fact that they have not been receiving any income, they have loans to pay, they're now going to spend an extra amount of money to get themselves COVID-19 compliant, if you like. They're going to have to put in more wash basins, they're going to have to put in sanitizers, which is an extra expense for, you know, schools and institutions that are already suffering. So it would be interesting to see that money that they say has been dispatched to schools today. Is it the same per capita? Is it, you know, something extra? What happens to enable these schools to be compliant with where we are? It would be interesting to see if we didn't just waste the last 7 months.
And I saw some schools, for instance, one of the schools where one of my children goes to, where they're saying that because of the social distancing requirements in their buses, now they'll have to review the transport costs.
It will cost you more.
Yes.
And those things, because now they'll carry 50% of what they usually carry.
So you pay for the empty seat.
You have to pay for the empty seat, which is really understandable, because, I mean, how are they going to maintain their fleet and those kinds of things?
But where are the resources?
But I wanted to say,
that is the question. Where are the resources? You see, if you're talking about extra pay for transport, the same parent who lost a job, whose business went under because of COVID-19, and you're now heaping extra costs on him or her, I don't know how sensitive we are as a country on this matter.
Jonas.
I think it is responsible to tell this to our fellow parents, that this is a test run.
Dry run.
Because the one thing that the government has not stepped forward to say, and we've said this before on this show, is we also don't know. This is new to us. We're just trying. So we'll open the pubs and see how many people will be fine and how many will get infected. The same thing applies to school.
That's right.
What you're not being told is, as a parent, as a family, you are on your own. You are on your own, essentially. You need to still make that decision as a parent, because this is a test run. You can go to school, kids can go to school, and there is a second outbreak, or they may not. They may go to school and all goes on very, very well. So it's a state of not knowing, and nobody is admitting
A-X, Joe, I think what Joe LK is talking about is how many classes now tunaza grade 4, class 8 na form 4. So wao ndo TriZex. Let's see how it goes with these 3 classes. Kwanza, give it a week or 2. If everything is okay, rate of infection don't go up, wanafunzi wako sawa, then I think you can start now thinking about the other classes. Because people have been asking, so wengine wataenda shule lini? So I think you're trying, unasema Linus, is what is going on here. Let's see how it goes with these classes. Then, ikiwa sawa, then we can add more. Isipokuwa sawa, then a decision will be made. Hiyo kujaribu na kuona kutakuwaje.
Sorry, lastly. I was speaking to somebody from the Ministry of Education.
Is that the last time you're saying lastly?
The very lastly. You know, I mean, people who cover politics and lastly are synonymous. I was speaking to somebody at the Ministry of Education and I was asking her, so how do you reconcile these schedules? And she was telling me that the plan or the idea is to have, you know, shorter terms next year, so
shorter
that
holidays.
Eventually, by the end of the year, we will have covered the lost time, and then we return to normalcy in 2021. 2022, sorry.
Yeah.
We return to normalcy in 2022. Remember, if exams were to be conducted in March next year, then it means by the following year in 2022, remember there's an election coming up in August.
Yeah.
So you don't want a scenario where people are campaigning in the middle of a school term.
Yeah.
So something needs to be done and done well and well thought out. Otherwise, we may end up with
But it will be a tight year for parents and students next year.
Because the closing will be one week
to catch up. Yeah. And there will be 2 national exams, March and December.
And probably December.
Hopefully, yeah.
All right, and lastly, we need to have the last words. And tonight we start
punching it.